The Herald of Free Enterprise capsized outside the harbor of Zeebrugge, Belgium, 90 seconds after leaving port. On the evening of March 6, 1987, 539 people were on board. 193 of them died. The ship had sailed with its bow doors open. Nobody on the bridge knew. There was no warning light. This is the story of a door that one man forgot to close, a company that had been asked to install an indicator light and refused, and a ship that went from upright to capsized in less time than it takes to read this sentence out loud. It is also the story of what happened when the law tried to hold a company responsible for the deaths of nearly 200 people, and why it took 20 more years before the law could actually do it. The Herald of Free Enterprise was 7 years old when it sank. Built in West Germany in 1980, it operated for Townsend Thresen on one of the busiest maritime routes in the world, the English Channel crossing between Dover in England, Calais in France, and Zeebrugge in Belgium. The Herald was one of the Spirit-class ferries, a group that included the Spirit of Free Enterprise and the Pride of Free Enterprise. On any given sailing, the ship carried a mix of lorry drivers, families in cars, foot passengers, and crew. The crossing was short, the schedule was tight, and the pressure to turn the ship around quickly at each port was built into the company's operating culture. The Herald was a roll-on, roll-off ferry, which meant vehicles drove in through large doors at the bow and drove out through doors at the stern, or vice versa, depending on the port. The car and vehicle deck ran the length of the ship as an open space with no internal barriers dividing it into sections. This design made loading fast. It also meant that if water reached that deck in any volume, it had nothing to stop it from spreading across the entire length of the ship. On the evening of March 6th, the Herald had loaded its passengers and vehicles at Zeebrugge and was preparing to depart for Dover. The channel crossing was routine. Nobody on board had any particular reason to think the evening would differ from the hundreds of crossings the ship had made before. The man responsible for closing the bow doors that evening was the assistant bosun, Mark Stanley. In that evening, he was off duty and asleep in his cabin when the boarding process began. Nobody woke him up. The doors stayed open. The first officer, Leslie Sibel, was supposed to be on the car deck to verify the doors were closed before the ship sailed. He was there for part of the loading process, watching the vehicles come aboard. When he was satisfied that loading was complete, he left the car deck and went to his departure station on the bridge. He left before checking whether the doors had actually been secured. The bosun, Terence Ailing, walked past the open doors on his way through the car deck. He saw them. He did not close them, because closing them was not his assigned responsibility. Captain David Lurie, on the bridge, had no way to know any of this. The Herald of Free Enterprise had no indicator light on the bridge to show whether the bow doors were open or closed. This was not an oversight that had gone unnoticed. In the years before the disaster, captains of the Herald and the other Spirit-class ferries had submitted written requests to the company asking for a warning light to be installed. The company had considered the request and decided against it. The standing instruction to the crew was that the captain should assume the doors were closed, unless specifically told otherwise. Under that system, silence meant safe. At approximately 7 to 5 in the evening, with the bow doors still fully open, the Herald of Free Enterprise left Zeebrugge and began accelerating into the North Sea. As the Herald accelerated away from Zeebrugge, water began entering through the open bow doors. At the speed the ferry was traveling, the bow wave pushed water up and over the vehicle ramp, flooding directly onto the open car deck. What naval architects call the free surface effect took hold almost immediately. Water spreading across an undivided deck has no barrier to slow it, and as the ship began to roll with the slight motion of the sea, that water shifted to the port side and kept shifting. Within 90 seconds of leaving the harbor, the Herald had listed 30 degrees to port. 30 degrees is not survivable for a ship of this type. Passengers in the cafeteria were thrown sideways. Cars broke free from their positions on the vehicle deck. People who had been standing found themselves suddenly on walls that had become floors. The Herald rolled past the point of recovery and capsized onto its port side. What prevented the loss of every person on board was the water depth. The capsize happened in approximately 10 meters of water, close enough to the harbor that the ship came to rest on a sandbank, with roughly half its hull above the surface. That accident of geography, that the ship capsized in shallow water rather than open sea, is the reason 346 people survived. Those who died were mostly trapped inside. The water was 3 degrees Celsius. In water that cold, the time before incapacitation from hypothermia is measured in minutes. The capsize happened close enough to Zeebrugge that rescue vessels reached the scene within minutes. Belgian and British rescue teams worked through the night, cutting through the hull, pulling survivors from flooded compartments, and lifting people from the water by helicopter. Inside the capsized ship, the darkness was almost total. Passengers and crew found themselves in corridors that ran sideways, in cabins filling with cold seawater, in stairwells that now pointed horizontally rather than up. Many who survived described not knowing, in the first minutes, which direction was out. In one of those passages, a passenger named Andrew Parker, an off-duty banker, positioned himself across a gap between two sections of the ship and held there, using his own body as a bridge, while other passengers climbed over him to reach safety. He held that position long enough for an estimated 30 people to pass over him, before he was pulled clear himself. For that, he was awarded the George Medal. Of the 539 people on board, 346 survived. 193 did not. 4 months after the capsize, the Sheen report was published by Sir Barry Sheen, the wreck commissioner appointed to lead the formal investigation. The findings were direct. The assistant bosun had not been woken up. The first officer had left the car deck without confirming the doors were closed. The captain had no indicator light to tell him otherwise. And the company had known this gap existed because captains had asked for a warning light in writing, and the company had declined. The line from the Sheen report that entered the public record and stayed there described the management culture at Townsend Thorsen as infected, from top to bottom, with the disease of sloppiness. In 1989, P&O European Ferries, which had acquired Townsend Thorsen, and 7 individuals were charged with manslaughter. The trial began in 1990 and collapsed before a verdict. The judge ruled that prosecutors had failed to identify a single person in the company whose gross negligence could be pinned directly to the deaths. Under the law as it stood, a company could only be guilty of manslaughter if a specific controlling individual was personally guilty of gross negligence manslaughter. Nobody fit that definition clearly enough. All charges were dropped. The disaster also prompted the creation of the Marine Accident Investigation Branch, the MAIB, in 1989, a dedicated body that did not exist before the Herald went down. It took 20 years. The Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act was passed in the United Kingdom in 2007, making it possible for the first time to prosecute a company as an entity for deaths resulting from gross management failure without having to prove it through one individual. The Herald case is the reason that law exists. The disaster also reached beyond British law. It led directly to the International Safety Management Code, adopted by the International Maritime Organization in 1993, which now governs safety management procedures on every commercial vessel operating worldwide under the SOLAS Convention. The Herald of Free Enterprise did not just change UK corporate law, it changed how maritime safety is managed across the entire industry. 193 people died because a door was left open, a warning light was never installed, and a company assumed silence meant safe. The law that followed took longer to arrive than most of those people had been alive.